I'm so grateful to have a chance to talk with you about dealing with a subject that's called leaning into the headwinds. The reality of ministry, I'll give you a little background. Many years ago, I came to Christ at age 22. I'm a prodigal son, raised by the finest Christian parents that you could ever imagine. My father, I never saw him sin or do anything wrong. He just was living a righteous and godly life, and in high school and college, I started going astray. My goal was to be president of the United States someday. Ended up at a homeless shelter president there. It's a little different, but I have almost no negative reactions to tweets, so I'm in a better place. So I am praising the Lord today. But what happened is, very quickly after coming to Christ, I began having a heart not for power, not for the things that I thought would make me happy. I wanted to be a big man of importance, but I kept going to church and hearing people talk about, in an area where we lived, there's a cult that had their national headquarters in Clearwater, Florida. And people were talking about how horrible this cult was. And there were prostitutes and drug addicts on the streets. And a group of us got together and started going out and sharing Christ with people on the streets. And we saw the love of Jesus pouring out. Every time we would stand on a corner and just pray, God, lead us and guide us. What do we do? And we would feel drawn to an individual who would walk over and say, I'm just standing out here thinking and praying, and I felt like God led me to talk to you. And for about 2 years, every person I talked to on the streets would say, you know, you're an answer to my grandmother's prayers, my mother's prayers. My dad always told me that wherever I went, Jesus would be calling me. Everybody we felt led to. And I began realizing that God was answering the prayers through my obedience of people who may have been dead for 20 or 30 years even. That a son or a daughter was being called back. That God's power was so overwhelming that circumstances didn't prevent salvation. Disobedience didn't dictate somebody's future, but the reality that God was there to redeem and to transform and to pull people back. So what my career has been is I started working in a psychiatric facility. I felt called to work in a psychiatric facility, and I drove in there without an education to work in a psychiatric facility. I had been in drugs and alcohol myself and had a broken life, and I thought, well, they'll never hire me. I used to seek counseling because I was so miserable and depressed. If I share with them what's really on my heart, I thought, well, they'll never hire me, so maybe God's leading me here so I can witness to the lady in HR. So the best thing I could do is just be bold and blatant Christian. So I gave her everything. She said, I've never heard anything like that. Would you work with our adolescents? I got double-crossed and I got hired. And imagine the audacity of putting a Christian in with broken teenagers. And I began sharing the gospel in a situation where in a psychiatric facility, in a drug rehab, there were broken kids that needed to hear the love of Christ. I had a passion for jail ministry, and I prayed for the opportunity to do that. And years into my serving the Lord, I was asked to be the chaplain at our local county jail. And from there, I was hired to run the shelter. My sister, I'm the youngest of 4 children, the only boy. My older sisters love telling people that I've spent my whole life either on the streets in rehab, jails, or shelters. And you never trust an older sister. So I'm so grateful, though, for what God has called me to, because my career has been about adversity. Not about personal adversity. It's been about seeing when people face hardship. In the testimonies we've heard so far, when people are reaching that place of their own end, they often look and say, where is their hope? What can I do? And you know, the headwinds, I looked up the definition of the term headwind. It says a force opposed to the course of a moving object. In business, in our life, very often we think somebody opposed to us must be our enemy. I love politics. I used to work for Congress before I started acting like a congressman and drinking too much and leaving Washington. But as a young man, I worked for Congress, and I saw people who would get so riled up with any hint of conflict or disagreement, that was back in 1980. Today, it hasn't improved a lot. When criticism happens, there's a balled up fist and an angry response. And yet we read in Proverbs 27, verse 17, iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. It doesn't say Christian iron with good intentions sharpens somebody. It says iron sharpens iron. That's the kind of headwind that sometimes in business drives us to say, God, what would you have me do? When I came to St. Matthew's House, Don tells the story. St. Matthew's House was founded as a Christian ministry by an Episcopal priest and a small group in a Bible study. Reading Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. We've already seen the verses today. I feel like the talk I'm giving you is really almost a summary of what everybody else has said. So if you want to nap, get comfortable and do so. Don't snore too loud. But in Matthew 25, Jesus said, at the final judgment, I will judge, were you really my followers? How would he judge that? Not that our actions save us, but if we're really his, are we going to live the same way we used to? So what happens in this passage is you see that Jesus says at the final judgment, and I'm separating the sheep from the goats. And in this story, even though goats are cute, you don't want to be one. Because he says, the sheep, my followers, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. When I was homeless or a stranger, you took me in. When I was sick, you cared for me. When I was in jail, you visited me. And the disciples responded, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or so on? And his response was, whatever you've done for the least of these, you've done unto me. Well, in that Bible study in Naples, Florida, which is the land of prosperity and nice houses and gated community and lots of golf courses, the question was, well, what's our responsibility? And the next day, in the Naples Daily News on the front page was a story of a man eating out of a dumpster about a block and a half from that church. When they reconvened the next week, they said, can I continue to say I'm a Christian based on what the gospel says if I look at my front page and I do nothing? And they said, we need to come together. And they got the Ministerial Association together. We were created as an independent not-for-profit where we're not affiliated with anybody. We started as a soup kitchen, feeding the hungry. And very quickly we saw there were people that needed shelter. And so we started sheltering the poor. And a small 18-bed shelter. And that grew. And by the time I was asked to come to St. Matthew's House, I was working in the jail. And I had gone through a lot of difficult experiences in the jail. Saw the psychiatrist in our jail murdered in the office next to mine. I saw lots of violence. I was called out to crime scenes and there to help folks with the most tragic and awful of circumstances. And what I came to realize is that my calling was to be in the headwinds. When somebody is on a course to their own destruction, that headwind that they're fighting against, sometimes they're mad at a deputy, and inmates would often say to me, why is it fair? Why am I here? And I said, because God put you here. What? God put me in jail? Yeah, he loves you. You were killing yourself out there. Well, this deputy, he pulled me over. I said, I know the deputies. They're lazy. They were eating donuts. Why do you think they arrested you? God inspired them. I know that guy. They said, the last time you prayed was when you saw blue lights in your rearview mirror. And, I would preach about the book of Exodus and the Israelites. And they so much loved the Israelites because they said, we must all be Jewish. Look what happened in the desert. God delivers them and immediately they go back. That's the deputies used to say, God must live in the booking room. That's where the inmates find him and where they leave him on their way out. What they were using Jesus as a coping mechanism instead of the answer to their life. And very often in our businesses, when adversity hits us, we use Jesus as merely a coping mechanism to get through a tough time instead of the opportunity to be transformed and to change course. When they asked me to speak, and I talked about leaning into the headwinds and dealing with adversity, and in the last couple of months, a lot of things have happened. We've had a key employee who was drunk at work and had to let her go. We had another employee who we had hired, had great hopes for, who just said, I don't want to be part of a Christian organization. The more I think about it, I don't want to be here. And then the largest hurricane ever to hit the mainland United States hit us. So, Mike, if I can, next year I'd like to speak about winning the lottery. And it just seems an obvious segue. And so, but when I was in the jail thinking about coming to St. Matthew's House, my experience with this ministry is that it had already had mission drift. It was only 17 years old, and it had gone from being committed to fulfilling the call of Christ to just being a good place to go and find a place to stay. We weren't really a Christian ministry. My predecessor was dying of cancer. On his deathbed, when a board member would come and visit him, he would always ask the question, "Are you here to fire me?" They'd say, "No, why? Why would you ask that, Frank?" No reason. And my first week at St. Matthew's House, I found that he had been embezzling money. I started going through the books and saw evidence of a trail of embezzlement. I saw evidence of abusive behavior in our facilities. Our 37 employees, there was one Christian. You would be very likely to get a curse word, very unlikely to find the love of Christ. I was sitting in the jail knowing what St. Matthew's House was in our community. And I was praying because I felt like God is telling me it's time to leave the jail ministry and to move on. And sitting in my office with just the struggle of knowing it was time to leave but not knowing where to go. What do you do when you've spent your life as a kind of street evangelist, a hospital administrator without a hospital administration degree? What do you do when you're a jail chaplain? There's not a real big market for jail chaplains, it turns out. And how am I going to support my family? And there in the office, I was just praying, God, what would I do if I left? I don't know. I know you're calling me to, but unless you open a door, I don't know what I'll do. And about that time, somebody knocked on my office door in the jail. And it was our mental health professional. And she said, "I'm the vice chair of St. Matthew's House. And, a couple of us really want to see St. Matthew's House going back to being a Christian ministry. And Frank is dying, and we're praying that somebody that has a heart for the broken, that understands addiction, that really has a heart for the Lord and understands a little bit about fundraising and really, but we don't know of anybody that we think fits the bill. And I thought about you. Do you have any friends that you went to college with that might be a good fit?" And so I said, "What?" And because God uses us sometimes and calls us in a way that we weren't prepared for. When I went to St. Matthew's House, my first meal, again, it is that thing when I sat through the lunch line, and I've never seen green fried bologna before. And that's right. And so my first thought was, whatever you do for the least of these, you've done unto me. And I thought, if Jesus was here, would I share my sandwich with him? And so I started praying about that because I really didn't know what to do. I was a jail chaplain. I'm a street evangelist. And now I'm leading a not-for-profit. Well, it turns out that God doesn't just use old business executives to start a Christian organization. Sometimes he uses guys with a heart for Christ and a heart for the broken to begin to share his love. And I said, "Lord, how do we turn this ship around?" The staff was profane and vulgar, and I started praying for them, and immediately I thought, the Lord dropped on my heart, you should start this catering business. This last year, we were voted by the Naples Daily News as the best catering company in Southwest Florida. We're the largest caterer now in Collier County, which is the billionaire coast where all the billionaires in America have homes. And we have 9 full-time catering staff. We have 3 objectives with that business. Every business that we created had a revenue goal, that they would cover their expenses and return support to fund the ministry. Secondly, they would have a service goal. So in this case, we wanted to serve the best shelter food in America. And the third component was they were involved in discipleship. So on any given day, our chef I go into the kitchen, and if I don't see the chef working with, or one of our chefs working and discipling, because teaching food service is a pretense for discipleship. Everybody that comes to St. Matthew's house doesn't want Jesus, but they do want a hope. They do want a way off the streets. They want a way to support themselves. So we offer them the idea that we'll give them a job and we'll train them for a brighter future. But while they're learning to cut some things up, we're talking to them about the nature of their life and what they're doing. So every couple of weeks, the chef will come to our managers meeting and say, we had a chance to lead this person to Christ. When we do baptisms, the last one we baptized 29 people from our drug and alcohol program that had come to Christ. And the reality is, none of those people came to Christ because they were on a winning streak. Probably y'all didn't either. How many around our table said, I'm doing so good, I should join God's team. Maybe he would want to draft me. That's not how I did it. The headwinds was God resisting the proud, resisting the broken. In my business, I sometimes have responded that way. I want to read a passage in James chapter 1. It says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Now imagine that. Count it all joy when you face trials, because God is going to produce a harvest. That first week at St. Matthew's house, I also had a very important phone call. A lady called up and started screaming at me at the top of her lungs about how stupid we were and how incompetent we were. And I said, I know. And Mom, please, I've got to get back to work. And that's actually not true. She'll probably listen to this later. It wasn't my mom. She is a saint. So that call was from an angry lady who said, I called your thrift store, and they said it's going to be 3 weeks before they can get here to pick up my stuff. My mother died, and she's passed away, and we're cleaning out her condo, and I'm trying to donate the stuff, and you can't even get here for 3 weeks. What kind of incompetence is this? I said, I'm so sorry. I'm new here, and I am not making excuses. I just apologize. Could I give you the number of the Salvation Army or the Goodwill? And she said, you're the 9th place I called. Nobody would call St. Matthew's house first. She just kept the insults coming. And so I sat there and I thought, how do we do that? I thought, if nobody's meeting this need and I'm facing angry people, maybe the answer to the fact that we have this insignificant thrift store that's losing money this month, maybe the answer is, Jesus, would you help me? I'm not a business guy. I'm not a marketing retail guy. What should we do? And the Lord said, get there first. So we started advertising. The only time we ever advertised in the paper, fast free pickup. And we borrowed a thrift store truck from somebody else. And I announced changes. God had spoken to my heart. There were 4 people in the organization that were really destructive. And until they left, we wouldn't really move ahead. So I started praying for their salvation. The first one was our thrift store manager. When I told her we were going to get busy and we were going to change some things and we were going to bring in new help to get more stuff more quickly, she said, well, if you're making those changes, I quit. And I praise God, from whom all blessings flow. And so sometimes she gets mad and does this stuff. Good. Don't ask her back. And we prayed for her, and we blessed her and released her to a better future for us. And the reality was, in doing that, we went from being a store that was losing money to in August, which is the slowest time of the year in Southwest Florida, to having a net profit that month of $20,000. It's like, wow. God knows business. This is so cool. So I go on down to James chapter 1, verse 5, where it says, if any of you lacks wisdom, and my life proves that I do lack wisdom, So James was writing to me, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach. So God, when I face adversity, if I call on you, you'll give me a plan and you'll give me direction. And I sought godly counsel. I didn't go to business school. I studied to be a minister. And they don't teach, the worst businesses in our culture oftentimes are churches. I worked in the secular world and there was no heart. I worked in the church world and there was no excellence. And my goal was that St. Matthew's House would be a place that would be excellent. I didn't realize that Proverbs 27 was that I would need to be sharpened, that I would need adversity to become excellent because we were not. Today, nobody has the results we do. For 11 years straight, we've been voted as the best thrift stores in our community. This year we were voted as having the best coffee shop. We partnered with Starbucks. We approached Starbucks in Seattle we have drug addict women who have been prostitutes, who have been on the streets, who are getting their kids back from foster care as they've been getting sober and committing their lives to Christ. And they need a job to support their kids and to be stable. And so we thought we could train them to be baristas. So we approached Starbucks. So now we have a partnership where Starbucks underwrites 70% of the wholesale cost of our products. Starbucks isn't as evangelical as you might think, but they're into job training. And they're into education and the coffee culture. So we said, I like being caffeinated, and we're into training, but for a better purpose. If I train a lady to be a barista, and she gets skills and she's good, and she gets preferential hiring at the local Starbucks, I'm not only training and equipping her, I'm providing for her family, and I'm releasing her into the mission field. So our model now today is not about training people and keeping the best employees, but seeing God move our people on to changing the world. Because St. Matthew's House was about blessing the least of these. Today, we're about transforming our culture. By loving the least of these, the world takes notice of who we are. Very wealthy people who would have no reason to go to church because they have everything call us today and want to know why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing and what's working. I'm so grateful that today we've seen some wonderful things happen. One of my favorite stories to tell of the ministry of St. Matthew's House and of following God in these simple things is in 2009, we have a zero tolerance policy in our homeless shelter. And so if somebody drinks or drugs, we kick them out. And one of the guys we were kicking out, he said, I thought you were Christians. We are Christians. That doesn't mean you get to be drunk in our shelter. And he said, if you really cared, would you let me just go out on the streets with no place to go? I said, no, we care and we're protecting. But I just knew my answer was only partially true. Because I was telling him I have an obligation to protect the residents in our shelter. But he was right. Who was caring for him? And so God birthed a plan to start a drug and alcohol rehab program. And I wrote up a beautiful business plan, presented everything well. I was just stunning. And our board looked at the plan, and we had a board of directors, and we had 18 board members. And I got 1 vote for me and 17 against my plan. And I said, God has called us to do this. After the meeting, we had approved our annual budget, and I said to our board chairman, we've got an annual budget, and how we allocate staff is my responsibilities as the CEO. I said, you're right. How you allocate staff, how you assign them, that's your business. And I said, well, good, because the board just voted that we're not going to do a drug rehab, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. I won't exceed the budget, but I will do what God has called me to do. He said, that's really courageous. A year from now, you're either going to be unemployed or a hero. And so I said, dear God, smite the man. And but James 1, verse 12 says, blessed is the man who is steadfast under trial. For when he has stayed the course and stood the test, he will receive the crown of life. So we started a drug and alcohol rehab program with 13 beds for single men. A few months later, a family who had lost their only child to alcoholism came in, and they were being given a tour by my beautiful wife, Lisa, and she talked with them, and they said they wanted to talk to me a bit, and we asked about the needs. I said, well, we have some debts, and we have this drug and alcohol program. And they looked at each other, and they said, would you consider renaming that program in our son's memory? If we paid off your debts, if we gave you a budget for this, if we helped you with that. And so to date, they've made a remarkable difference. That family was the first significant donor that came in at the $1 million level to transform the work of St. Matthew's House. And so I got to tell the board chairman I'm a hero. And but staying the course in the midst of the storm, when you know God has called you to it, you transform your culture and you begin to transform your community. That's the passion that God has called us to. And in each of our businesses, we will face adversity. The same year we started that program, or shortly afterwards, I joined C12. My friend John Botsko asked me to come because he said, it's about business excellence, and you're so stupid. Would you come and join? And I found I could get so much out of that. And God did a work in my life through the work of C12. I would like to encourage one or two things in closing. That is, for any of you that have not-for-profits, not-for-profits have the right heart, but so often they need C12 for business excellence. There is not a not-for-profit in this community that won't be improved by developing their passion and their excellence they gain from the teachings in C12. We are a better business today because we are a better ministry, because we pursue excellence in all that we do. We are a better ministry because of the work of C12, so thank you for that. And we bless C12 because they need sarcasm in my board. And so in closing, the adversity in life, there is a quote from The Lord of the Rings, Gimli, the little dwarf. When they were about to face challenges, he said, slaughter, certainty of death, small chance of success. What are we waiting for? That's the attitude of a follower of Christ. The world is ours to be conquered with the love of Jesus Christ. Thank you.